Hi, it's Nicole, and today I'll be doing my April wrap-up. In April I read 8 books, but they were mostly pretty short, so this should be a pretty quick one. I'm also doing a TBR elimination challenge, so most of the books that I read were from my TBR, and most of the books from my TBR were really short ones so that I could quickly eliminate a big batch of books from my list right at the start. I'll also put a counter somewhere on the screen to tally up how many of the books that I read this month were from my TBR pile, and I think I'll probably do that in future wrap-ups, just so I and you, if you are interested, can keep track of how many books from my TBR I'm actually reading. The first book that I read in April was The Old Man of the Moon by Shěn Fù. This one was interesting to me because it is a non-fiction book from a Chinese author from the 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s maybe. And from my really scant research, I think it's one of the few examples of just everyday life in China at that time. What was particularly interesting about this book to me was the dynamic between a lot of sexism, but there were also these proto-feminist things inside there every so often. The idea, for example, that if the woman in this had been a man, then she would be able to do more. And I thought that was really interesting because of the time that the book is written in, and because it sits next to other ideas in here that are pretty clearly sexist. Overall, I'd say I'm glad I read it, but it wasn't super memorable to me, and it might very well end up in the donation pile rather than kept on my shelves. The next book I read was John Ruskin's Traffic. I bought this book, I'm pretty sure, the same time that I bought the Shěn Fù book, but it's been so long since I bought them, at least 2 years, maybe 3. And I completely forgot why I bought either of them, and I didn't bother reading the back of either of them to recap what they were about, so this one kind of took me by surprise a little bit. I really liked a lot of what John Ruskin had to say. I think politically we're probably on the same page overall. That said, this is the only thing I know from him, so maybe our ideas would diverge the further in I go with this. And I actually looked up John Ruskin a little bit more and found some things that I thought were a bit disturbing about his character, so I don't want to ally myself too closely to him. But this book was very interesting for anybody who is very socialist or anyone who is interested in art. The discussion in particular about taste and about architecture and about the social relationship we have with each other and the societies that we build based on different types of mindset, I guess. This was also the first book. So another thing I should mention, I really have been wanting to get into annotation of some sort, partly because ever since I took part in Emma Watson's book club when they were reading Feminism Is for Everybody, that was the first time I was really annotating and making more in-depth notes, I guess, about the book that I was reading. That was the first time I did that since maybe high school, and I found it really beneficial for me personally, and I felt like the video that I made after that, having those notes, was a stronger video, and I really like what came out of that. I really like what I gained from doing that, and it's something that I kind of wanted to do more, but there are lots of things that have stopped me from doing that. So things like, if I borrow a library book, I'm not going to write up in that book, obviously, but one of the big things for me is that I don't tend to keep that many of my books. I usually donate them or give them to a friend after I finish reading them, so it kind of feels a bit I don't know, unfair or something to be writing up in my books knowing that I'm not going to keep them and I'm going to be giving them to someone else who might not want a book that has loads of writing in it like that. That said, I know that if I'm donating the book to a charity shop or something, a lot of people probably have that expectation that some books are going to have writing in them, and they quite like that even. I mean, if I got a book that had some writing in it, I would quite like that. I think it's interesting to see the notes that other people have made, and I might actually learn something from that other person's notes. Anyway, all of that aside, this book I started annotating in pen as well. I don't know if I have any, oh, you can't really see it. Mostly I was just underlining some things, but occasionally I would just write little notes and stuff. Anyway, I really liked that practice, and I think I'm going to continue annotating my books in some way. I'm not entirely sure if I like the writing directly in the book thing. I might actually prefer getting a notebook dedicated into my thoughts on whatever book I happen to be reading. But then to make it easier to search, I think I might make that something that's digital, so I can quickly look through it, even though I like the process of writing things down with my hands. But anyway, this is all neither here nor there, and I might do a proper video on my thoughts about annotating and getting into it and all of that stuff. But this is the first book recently that I've annotated in directly, because even when I was scrawling notes in Feminism Is for Everybody, I was doing that digitally. And I mean, I do make notes in my digital ebooks and highlight stuff all the time, but I was like properly writing loads and loads of notes every other page. So yeah, this is the first time I did it physically. Next we have La Nostalgie Heureuse by Amélie Nothomb, and this was not, to me, it wasn't up to the standard of her other books that I've read. This book is this sort of behind the scenes story of a documentary that was made of Amélie Nothomb going back to Japan. It is the behind the scenes of a documentary that she agreed to, well, she proposed doing this documentary to a French channel, and she was very surprised when they said, yes, we'll do that documentary of following you around Japan when you revisit all of these places and people who you knew when you were living there 16 or 32 years ago, depending on who the person is. I watched the documentary not knowing that there was a book. This one felt more interesting because I knew the documentary already, but other than that, I would say you can give it a miss. It wasn't, I don't know, there just wasn't a whole lot to it, and the end of it felt like it was trying to settle on some sort of philosophical conclusion that would help to wrap things up and round it all off, tying the story together somehow, and it didn't work that way for me. I feel like that conclusion would have worked better with a different story, maybe, I don't know, and would have been powerful with a different story, but it just, it was okay. I think what I value a lot of the time when I do read books from her that I'm not necessarily enthused about is the fact that I'm reading them in French, and I feel like I'm benefiting from that process, and I enjoy that process. So still not gonna call this one a loss. I don't know if I'll keep it on my shelves or not, because I think I tend to keep my French ones on my shelves anyway, partly because I don't know if the charity shop would want something that's not in English over here. I don't know.